Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining. My name is Katie. I'm joined by one of the Business Reimagined coaches, Andrea McNeil, and we're really happy to share with you our talk today, from disruption to direction, human-centered restructuring for HR and leaders. So we're looking at moving beyond change management to the more human side of change. We know that lots of our clients and lots of our friends and family even are going through an enormous amount of change at the moment. And that can be hugely stressful for them, for their partners at home. And we want to help make that as nice a process as possible. So who are we, first of all? Well, we're both part of Business Reimagined, a global women-owned consultancy that helps organisations to achieve peak performance, well-being and business results effortlessly. So if that sounds like something that you'd like to get on board with, then of course do reach out and let us know. So let's tell you a little bit about ourselves first of all. Andrea, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Andrea McNeil. I've had a 35-year career in people and organisation development, fellow of the CIPD. So all you HR people out there, hello. I have had in-house roles as capability development director, HR director. I operate as a consultant, coach and facilitator across change programs, global change programs, scale-up startups. I've had experience of running redundancy processes and experience redundancy myself as an employee. So seeing it from all angles and coaching through people through that process.
Okay, brilliant. So real breadth of experience from Andrea. And my experience is a bit different because I've been solely on the consultancy side. So I started life at what was the Centre for High Performance Development before moving to Australia, working for Development Dimensions International, DDI, moving back and working for two companies that are now both owned by Talergy, and one in the middle focusing on engagement. So all of those consultancies, working my way up to country manager, really looking at how do we help organisations to get the best out of their people, whether that's through the hiring processes, development, finding and accelerating your high potentials, and even making sure that they're engaged and motivated the whole time. So, but where I come in terms of this change management piece, for one thing, Business Reimagined, we work with different companies to offer our peak performance coaching, and we use that instead of what you might call outplacement, which we find just a more positive lens on helping people see their innate resilience. And we'll talk a bit about that as we go through, because ultimately what happens when we become disempowered, and we really are during these kind of restructures, especially if you're on the end and you're being asked to leave, then people lose their resourcefulness. But it's always there. It just gets a little bit hidden, and we help people to find that again. But what I'm going to be talking to you on a consultancy, from a consultancy perspective today, is about assessment centres. So I have run for hundreds of different people and, tens of clients to look at how do we know who we want to keep in the redundancy process and what would be a fair way to do that. And often clients such as kind of Volkswagen or AstraZeneca have used this process to look at how do we assess the people that we want to keep and make it really fair, and not just based on the internal data that we have. We get an external lens. So we're going to cover today, what it takes to get through restructures and redundancy and transition in the pressure of all the uncertainty that we're facing. So whilst protecting performance, well-being and trust, we'll look at more than just the ADKAR or Kotter type model to change, and really look at the human elements of transition. And we'll look at a new form of assessment centres, which is task-based assessment centres. So that's what we're going to be covering today. And if you have questions, you're welcome to write those in the chat. So Andrea, let's start with a restructure and redundancy. We know there's a huge amount of it going on. It's being caused by a lot of factors. Sometimes it's economic, often it's multiple factors where companies have to really focus and think what's working and what's not and restructure their businesses. And of course, digital AI transformation. We're just seeing that in so many clients. So tell us a little bit about maybe some of the memorable kind of restructures, if you like, and why some of those things happened.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, if I look back over my career and experience of restructures and redundancies, when you're in an HR position, you're very much custodian of compliance. You are there really to ensure that all the legal factors are covered. And in some respects, you end up sitting alongside the employer more to protect the employer, to make sure everything's done correctly. And sometimes it's very easy, from my experience, to lose sight of the employee experience. So there's a kind of multifaceted thing. There's organization, there's leaders going through it, there's HR trying to create that balance, and there are employees also being affected by it. And of course, HR are also employees, so that adds another dimension. And as you pointed out earlier, you know, our traditional approach is we agree the structure, we get all the roles sorted out, and then we'll probably go through a process of reapply for a job, outsource certain roles, enable people to leave if that's the right choice for them. And that's only the start of the process. Generally, if it's big enough, you will then end up creating a change management process, such as ADCAR, as you mentioned, which is a very, I suppose, kind of outside-in view of change, where it's more about the organization giving the parameters, the rationale, the context of change, and hoping that that is enough to get the employee re-engaged, understand what's going on, and buy into the whole process. And as anyone that's experienced it knows, it's never as linear and straightforward as ADCAR or COTA or anyone else assumes, because what we're dealing with is humans, right? So humans are individual and have a different experience of these things, and standard processes like ADCAR, in my experience, miss that human individual element, and there's a cost to the organizational health when you do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to note, that often the more cynical people who might say, well, you know, people just need to get on board with the change. You know, that's what I hear sometimes from leaders, you know, why aren't they on board? We've all been told what we need to do. And what we do at Business Reimagined, and whether that's about redundancy and change or leadership development or well-being, we help people to understand that it's always an individual experience. And it's actually never a collective experience. You know, it is in terms of all of these individuals going through it at the exact same time. However, it's individuals with their own inner world, seeing it through the lens they have, which could be positive or negative. Again, if I think about a few people I know going through redundancy at the moment, some of them, they can't wait. They're like, bring it on. I'm ready to leave. I've done my time. Give me the money and let's go. Other people have never been through it before, or, you know, maybe a little bit more frightened. They're just saying, what does this mean? What's this mean for my mortgage, for my family? What does it mean for my sense of identity? And all of these, yes, there might be some overlap, but ultimately it's a hugely individual experience.
Yeah, I think the assumption is that, you know, there's a great quote that says, you know, if I explain the rationale enough times, something will resonate and you'll all get on board. And if you don't, it's due to your resistance, not because it's something we're doing wrong. So there's a kind of like that all or nothing doesn't work. And what I hear as a coach of people who've gone through it, as well as someone in a senior position, is no matter what your choice is, whether someone chooses to leave or needs to stay or whatever, is sometimes I feel confused, I feel alone, everything's up in the air, it feels chaotic. I don't understand what's happening. No one's paying attention to how I feel being left behind when my colleagues leave. How am I going to fit into a new team, a new role, etc.? So whilst, you know, the communication side of those processes tries to address that, it doesn't go deep enough to the change that's happening within that individual and often the people that they're working with as well. So, and the other side of that is often these restructures require new hires because you're looking for new capability or new leaders. And even in that, there's a kind of a missing piece of doing all the work to create the role profile, to recruit, to select, to onboard. But there's not enough attention paid to, well, who are you replacing? What gap are you filling? What is the legacy or the shadow left behind by the person who was in that role? Or what do you need to do to establish your place in the system, as I would call it? So there's so many under the radar things going on that I think, from my experience, are the things that really derail a good change process or reinforce it.
Yeah, no, some great insights there. And let's get practical now, because we can be quite theoretical as, business psychologists in my sense, and I know you're obviously an experienced coaching consultant now, and we're very much, in the field. So tell us, if you had to give people today one or two, real pieces of practical things that they can do and take away from hearing this, what could they do?
Yeah, I guess for me, to navigate change differently, it's about changing the view or the understanding of change, and the view and the understanding of all the elements that make up an organization. In simple terms, I always see organizations as like a spider's web. And if you change one part of it or you touch one part of it, it reverberates through the whole piece. So you can't just say, I'll remove this and nothing will happen. It's, I'll remove this and I've got to be aware of what the impact is on the rest of the system. So even having that systems view starts to look at, you can look at change differently. So for me, that's where you begin. Seeing change differently as well from we talk about change management, but for me, change is a one-off event or circumstance that happens to people within an organization. It's an outer external change. What goes on underneath it is what we would call transition. So starting to recognize that transition is a psychological process that everybody in the organization will be going through. And it's characterized by a natural sense of disorientation, often uncertainty, chaos, where the deeper level of change starts to really have an impact. That's where the attention is needed. And that's where we're suggesting that change management can be done better. So paying attention to that transition process, realizing that everything in change has an ending, or transition has an ending, and paying attention to ending well. People leaving, how do you do that well? A team in its old form, ending that well, that's part of it. Looking at the neutral zone that sits in the middle of this transition process, and being really aware to try not to hurry people through that liminal stage of uncertainty just because it's uncomfortable, but actually supporting people through that phase to get to a new beginning better and with more ease. So the new beginning is where everything reforms in a different place. It's almost like the spider's web has been rebuilt to kind of accommodate whatever's needed now. So this process of transition is not linear. There could be several processes going on at the same time, and it isn't a to Z and we're done. You can kind of be revisiting things over and over, but there is a natural flow to this that I think recognizing this adds another level of success.
Yeah, no, some great points. And it reminds me actually of one of the consultancies that I worked for. They weren't good at those endings. And when I took over the team, I was managing 20 people, and within the first year, 80% of that team left, 16 people left, had to replace them. But they were just really burnt out. And unfortunately, I'd got to the point where they were already very much looking for roles. But as soon as the first person left, and it was within my first 2 weeks, even though I didn't know them well, I'd sent an email out to say, just want to thank you for your work, and you've added a lot, and you've made some great friends, you've had impact here, and thank you. And a lot of people kind of pulled me aside and said, thank you for doing that, like this hasn't been done here before. And it just shows you that if that hadn't been being done, then how were people feeling valued who were left? Again, sometimes we focus on people leaving, but it is about looking after the people who are still there. If we think about the project that we're both working on, and in fact 10 of our coaches are working on that project globally, we are helping the people that remain through our peak performance coaching, because as you say, roles have changed. Some of them are doing a completely different role. I mean, they're not at all in the same role. So for them, they're having to learn different things, work with different people. Sometimes they're still doing part of their old job as they're transitioning in. So there's all of this, the messy middle, as I know I've heard you talk about here. And you want to retain people in that sense and help them come to that good resolution at the end, losing colleagues, as you say, and everything else. So
yeah, absolutely. It definitely is a kind of a place where we skip over it too readily. And it's not just about looking after those that remain in terms of here's a few workshops to give you the new strategy. It's as your heart and soul, what do you need to do to help you release from the old state and start joining the new organization as it reforms?
yeah. And I think coming to the leadership part of that, one is, as you said, not to rush it because people are at their own pace. And yet we do need to be firm with the expectations, which is what needs to be done now. And yet at the same time, there's the how can I help you? And more importantly, just how are you feeling and why? And that's what people want, isn't it? They want to be heard, but often, you know, managers, they're caught up in it as well. They're navigating change and they often don't have the headspace to do that, and they're overwhelmed. And again, that's what our coaching really helps with. So let's move to a slightly different topic now for the second half of our call, which is about task-based assessment centres. So I've done a lot of these. I mean, again, assessment centres at different levels for recruitment, executive assessment, and of course, there's always a tinge of sadness to do redundancy assessment centres because we know that people are going to be potentially losing their jobs. But I always took kind of, I can't think of the word. I always liked the fact that I was bringing fairness to the process. So I thought at least people can think there's an external benchmark, there's an external perspective being used here, because again, we can really get in our heads, can't we, about this is favoritism and why not me? And I like to think that that really brought an element of transparency and fairness. But what we've been seeing lately, and by lately, actually, I mean the last 10 years, is research by Dr. Duncan Jackson and different members of his faculty at King's Business School. And he has found that competencies are actually confounded, as he calls it, and it means that they can't be measured. And just to set the context here, we're used to looking at competency frameworks, and again, you were in HR, so you would be recruiting people probably, and you have the job role and you have the behaviors and the questions to ask, like fine. But when we try and use competencies as measurement, we're saying that facilitating others, or it could be making effective decisions, is made up of lots of behaviors, but it isn't. It's just a title, and that's the confusion. So this research is showing that it's true for 360s, it's true for assessment processes. You cannot score competencies. To do it at that level is inaccurate. Now, what does it mean? For one thing, it leaves an organisation open to a lot of risk of litigation. And I saw earlier this year in a panel, actually Bina Kandola was there on the panel, and he just stopped for a moment and he said, if this is true, and I know you're credible and you've done this research, then this could be disastrous, and it probably will only get changed when there's a litigation. So what he's saying now is that the effective way of doing it, when you look at research, it is the exercise, so the situation, that is the constant that can be measured, not the competency, because we don't work in competencies, do we? I mean, what's your experience with competencies? If you have someone and you've got decision-making, communication, and delegating, I mean, you don't use them separately, do you?
Never. I mean, if even in a simple terms, way back, you would talk about, say, situational leadership. You wouldn't go, oh, let me just ask what you do here. Do you talk to them? Do you give them feedback? You kind of context the whole piece and saying, if somebody's self-managing, what would you do in that situation? What's the situation, and how do you employ your skills and talents as a leader and manager to deal with that? You never talk about competencies in that way.
Of course, and this is the real challenge, and what's jarring then about this, because I've been in a lot of organizations, and sometimes it's for recruitment but often for assessment. And I remember being in a plant in Wales, and the guy who was the team leader, he just took me to one side. He said, look, can I be honest with you, we only use the competency framework when we're trying to get promoted, that's it, or if you're getting hired for the job. And so it just shows you, like, there's this massive disconnect in organizations. I'm not saying they don't have any value, because they can just help us organize things. But we know we don't work in that way. And when we're coming from a measurement perspective, when we need things to be accurate, it isn't accurate to use assessment.
And yet it is used as a measurement tool. So yeah, it's a really interesting shift of kind of focus to say measurement via these tools is not really valid anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And the good thing is that task-based assessment centres, it's more simple. Scoring simple because it makes sense. You know, I work with assessors all the time. I'm a trained trainer of assessors. And of course, they get stuck with competences. Well, does it sit here or here? Well, we don't know because it's all made up. So a task-based assessment looks at the task, and that could be having a change conversation with someone that's leaving the business. And that would be asking how they're feeling, you know, telling them clearly about the change, you know, responding to their questions. And so it's much simpler because it's a set of behaviours within the task itself. So I know that not many people have heard of this, and that's why I actually feel very strongly about it, and to help bring this to the forefront, because it's something I would love to do more of with people, and help show them this different way internally as well, because I think behavioural observation is critical skill as a leader anyway. And what I find is that when we train in-house, you know, business leaders to do this, to support with development centres and assessment centres, I believe their leadership improves because they have better direct observation skills, which translates into better feedback and development. So we've covered those two areas now. Let's start to think about bringing it back together, about what does this mean, and think about it in a summary, so that people leaving today, if they're going through restructure and they're thinking over about their team, or they're an HR person potentially, and they're thinking, yeah, how could I influence my team so that we can do this even better? What are some of your things that you want to finish with?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you, that I've kind of come into a new field like systemic coaching and constellation work, primarily because it fills the gap of like what's going on in the system. It's about using tools like that to help individuals, leaders, teams uncover what's happening in the moment. That's all you do, first of all, via a whole kind of experiential workshop or some online tools. And when you uncover what's happening in a very embodied sense, you can then enable people to say, what's the single next step to better? That's it. There's not a big solutioneering. There's not a big hard and heavy program. It's just allowing people to understand where they are in their transition and the process, and start to come up with their own solutions and their own sense of what needs to happen to make slight shifts along that pathway to the new state. So it's kind of almost as simple as that, normalizing how people are feeling, being able to step into that sense of, I'm feeling this way, not just in my head, but also in my whole self, is such a big shift for people, but it is so powerful in starting to really embed change and embed people's sense of power in that.
And if people aren't familiar with constellations, how many people might be involved in those kind of work, and at what level?
The weird thing is you can do a constellation with an individual on an online call. You can, with objects on your desk. You don't need any fancy tools. There's all sorts of things you could use, but you literally could use paper clips and objects. And all you're asking people to do is use these objects as a representation of different parts of the system that they're in, or different things that they're experiencing. So it kind of takes them away from the I'm in it to I can view it. And when I can see it and I can see what's happening, then I can see what slight shift might be needed to make something feel different. It's incredibly powerful, but it's incredibly simple. And it goes right up to, you could do group constellations in an experiential workshop, you can do team ones. But as I say, it is accessible within an online coaching session, just in the moment.
No, that's really good. And what I'm hearing is that kind of bird's eye view almost, where you can see it from a different perspective. But what about if an HR person's listening to this and they say, well, that's all well and good, but we've got 500 people going through this process?
Yeah, and I think, again, that's what I was touching on in normalizing this process, offering some micro learnings, what's going on, not what's my strategy, but what's happening to me, so that once people see that this strange space in the middle of their experience is okay, it's normal, it's not to be shut down, and doing that via some small online learning moments, and blend that with some coaching so that people can kind of express where they're at and deepen their understanding, plus some virtual workshops or some in-person workshops or webinars, is that blended approach can really help people get through that transition in a much more considered way than just hoping that they get the comms message every now and again.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we do in our peak performance coaching, isn't it? And actually in our peak performance fundamentals courses, which we do online, and it could be face to face, but it's really helping people understand the inner world and where our experience comes from, because we think, yes, there's a comms about change, but the inner world experience that we have varies massively. And when we understand that for ourselves, we can do it more peacefully. And when we're a leader and we understand that, and we understand everyone has their own version of this inner world experience, then I think that opens the doorway to much more compassion, much more human-centered processes. So yeah, I know we're both advocates, and if anyone's interested, then you can reach out to us. And I would just say as well, if the task-based assessment process sounds interesting, then feel free to get in touch, because we know that in the age of AI, we need different leaders, and this is only going to become more and more prevalent, because we need people to be able to manage people well amongst change, which is going to be a new constant, we know, and manage mixed teams of humans and AI, because we know there's already people managing groups of agents, or agents that manage groups of agents. So people really are going to have to be adaptable in terms of their style, what they need from work, this narrative that we have about what work means. And we've already seen a big shift in that with COVID, because work used to be going to an office and having a desk, or maybe you were hot desking and that was coming in. But now, of course, that's been challenged. So I think they've been stretched a little bit mentally in terms of what we expect. But I think there are ways that we can test and look at this and help people through that more easily through the coaching work we do.
Yeah, and I almost honestly think this is an ideal time. It's like we are in a massive state of change generally in the world, with the AI and the digital arena kind of expanding. And if we don't shift how we develop people and take people through these changes, we'll end up kind of chasing our tail a little bit and kind of having to patch over the gaps, if you like, in the spider's web, and actually to be front and center and look at how we do things differently and head off some of the issues, I think puts any organization on the front foot for being better performing and dealing with these challenges.
So if you are watching this and you want to reimagine what change looks like in your business, then reach out to us, because we would love to have an initial conversation and see how we can help. Thanks so much for your time, Andrea.
Thank you.